Hi everybody, you're listening to Comics and History, episode number 101, part 2, The Curious Case of the Post-Crisis Lex Luthor, continued. And welcome to the show. I am your host, Brian J. Rygate, and class is back in session as we continue our look at the post-crisis Lex Luthor as he existed between the period 1986 and 1995. So I ended off part 1 by talking about how Lex Luthor II was successful in making sure that nobody who knew that he was in fact the original Lex Luthor in a cloned body was still alive. The one scientist who had been a part of this terrible cloning process was killed in his hospital bed by Lex Luthor II and his assistant Sidney Happerson. So moving forward, what happened to Lex Luthor II? Well, he still had to keep up public appearances, and he was the darling in the eyes of the Metropolis public. He had come back at a crucial time during the Panic in the Sky storyline, and it was Lex Luthor II who provided his vast financial resources to help Superman and the Justice League defeat Brainiac. And then because he was so skillful in saving LexCorp from dissolving, basically the economy of Metropolis turned itself around within a very short time. So while people loved Superman, they certainly loved Lex Luthor II. And as I mentioned in part 1 of this episode, Lex II was very successful in making sure that people like Perry White, Lois Lane, Clark Kent, and Superman believed that he was on the level, that he was a much better man than his quote-unquote father. And in case you're wondering about years, it was sometime around 1991 that Lex Luthor II first appeared, and one might have imagined that he would not last much longer after the revelation that Lex II was really Lex the First in a cloned body. But he stuck around for a surprisingly good amount of time. He was there during the whole death and return of Superman story arc. That's where a lot of people were actually introduced to Lex Luthor II, was during this seminal storyline. And of course, because he was still pretending to be one of the golden children of Metropolis, Lex II had to present himself as someone who was in mourning for Superman's death. But on the inside, he was raging over the fact that Doomsday had robbed him of the chance to be the one who would end the life of the Man of Steel. And then, of course, when Superman returned from the dead, yes, Lex was chagrined somewhat on the inside, but at the same time, he felt really happy because now he had a new opportunity to say, yes, I am the one who killed Superman, and I killed him for good. So Lex II managed to stick around in the Superman titles until just before 0 Hour. So we're talking about 1994 here. And basically what happened was that Lex had his eventual downfall. Lois was able to follow a paper trail which led her to learn that Lex II was really Lex the First. At the same time, Supergirl, who was questioning her identity and her place in society, came across a hidden laboratory which she discovered was filled with clones of herself. Not entirely perfect clones of herself, thank goodness, but what she realized was that Lex II, who supposedly loved her, was actually using her to build a clone army which would be at his disposal. So these two things came crashing down on Luthor, as well as the clone virus that was striking other cloned individuals within the DC universe. Well, characters like Superboy got a cure and returned to full health. For Luthor, it was devastating. He became emaciated. He lost all of his hair, lost his beard. He was at the point of death, and he said, well, this is it. There's no coming back from this. And so he made that classic, if I can't have it, nobody can have it decision. And he detonated a series of devices which completely leveled Metropolis. And so that's why at the time of Zero Hour, Metropolis looked like it was a post-apocalyptic shell of its former self. This was all because of Lex Luthor saying, well, this is going to be my stamp. I'm not going to let Metropolis continue without me. And so with all that was going on with Zero Hour, one might suppose that Lex Luthor had quietly died, but he had not. Instead, his lackeys managed to take him to a safe house where they worked to extend his life as long as possible. And then the event Underworld Unleashed happened. And basically, during that event, Neron was trying to gain supremacy over the Earth, or rather the universe. And to that end, Neron was going around the DC universe and making promises to various heroes and villains. And of course, Neron was ultimately defeated, but some of the promises that were made were actually kept. Of course, some promises were broken, some could be followed through because Neron was defeated, but in some cases, Underworld Unleashed was basically a way for DC to say, okay, here's where we can make certain revisions. And this was where Dan Jurgens and company could bring Lex Luthor back in more ways than one. Basically, Neron's deal with Luthor was kept, and so at the end of Superman Man of Tomorrow #1 from 1995, Lex Luthor was cured of the clone virus. And at the end of that issue, we saw a Lex Luthor who was tall, strapping, well-built, completely bald. Well, he had his eyebrows still, but he was in full health and ready to reclaim Metropolis, ready to finish off Superman once and for all. Basically, what we got here was a Lex Luthor who was a perfect blending of the best elements of the pre-crisis and the post-crisis Lex Luthors. He had the classic Lex Luthor look. He looked like somebody who, when equipped with the right battle suit and equipment, could take on the Man of Steel in hand-to-hand combat. He was brilliant, not just in business, but he would also turn out to be a brilliant scientific genius who was still able to use his business resources to employ people who could do his scientific dirty work. But at the same time, if it pleased him, he could also do certain experiments of his own. He had LexCorp there, so he didn't need to break into banks at the start of each appearance which he made. And he was clearly duplicitous. This was a Lex Luthor who was quite evil, but felt that what he was doing was actually for the greater good. He saw aliens like Superman as a legitimate threat. And so what he was doing was restoring order in a way. This was the Lex Luthor who would be the model for the pre-Flashpoint Lex Luthor. One could even say a model for the New 52 Lex Luthor. This was the Lex Luthor who would go on to become president of the United States. Time and again, he would end up being incarcerated for some horrible crimes, but he would always manage to come out of it by presenting rather solid evidence that it wasn't he who was to blame. There was always an imposter, like Alexander Luthor of Earth 3, that he could blame things on. He could say that he was being manipulated, that all of the Earth was being manipulated by larger, more malevolent forces. This interpretation of Lex Luthor was so convincing that when when Superman Birthright and later Secret Origin were rewritten, there didn't need to be a whole lot of revisions being made to Lex Luthor's backstory. Rather, the only changes for Lex Luthor in Birthright and Secret Origin were that Luthor did spend a short period of time in Smallville and ended up coming out of his experience hating the people of Smallville, thus explaining his animosity towards Clark Kent. But the other big revision was that the John Byrne interpretation of Lex Luthor as an older, stocky man who developed kryptonite radiation and had to be cloned in a newer, younger body by Roger Stern and Dan Jurgens and company, that element was removed. That whole clone Lex Luthor, the second angle, was gone. But certainly in the revised origins, Lex Luthor was somebody who was a scientific genius, as well as a brilliant man of business who formed LexCorp, which drove the center of Metropolis. And even looking at the New 52 Lex Luthor, you could say that he's very similar to the Lex Luthor that existed from 1996 through to the end of the pre-Flashpoint era. Certainly, the Post-Crisis Superman, as he's appearing in the Rebirth era, is finding himself stymied because in this new reality, this Lex Luthor doesn't really have anything that can be pinned on him. So, for all that Superman really hates the fact that Lex Luthor is wearing a red and blue battle suit and wearing the S-shield, there's nothing that Superman can really pin on this incarnation of Lex Luthor. Superman's going on his experiences with the Lex Luthor of his reality. And I think it really speaks to the inconsistent writing on the New 52 era Superman titles where, yeah, we did get an indication that Luthor had done something in the past. We knew that he was aligned with the military and helped them experiment on Superman in the early Grant Morrison run. And yes, Superman had made Luthor imprison himself in the prison of his design, but I don't think we were ever told what exactly it was that Luthor did. And certainly, following Forever Evil, Luthor's image was squeaky clean. So, who knows if we'll get an explanation as to what exactly the New 52 Lex Luthor did to get himself to the point where he agreed to imprison himself in a prison of his own design. Given the whole Rebirth initiative, I'm kind of doubtful that that's going to get explored, but I am wondering before he gets folded into the Rebirth continuity,